Good evening. What I'm about to tell you isn't conspiracy theory. It's historical precedent meeting current geopolitical reality. And if you own silver, you need to hear this right now. Jeffrey Sachs, one of the most connected economists in the world, just issued what he's calling a disaster warning. Most people heard it and thought he was talking about battlefields overseas. They're wrong. He's talking about what happens here, at home, when the government needs to fund a war it can't afford. Tonight, we're going to show you why a conflict with Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, could become the justification for the largest wealth confiscation in American history. We're going to explain why silver, not gold, is the primary target this time. And we're going to reveal why the signs are already visible if you know where to look. This isn't fear-mongering, this is pattern recognition, and the pattern is unmistakable. Let's start with what Jeffrey Sachs actually said. In a recent interview that's been making rounds in financial circles, Sachs warned of an impending disaster related to escalating tensions in South America. Specifically, he referenced the deteriorating relationship between the United States and Venezuela, a country sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves and increasingly aligned with Russia and China. Most analysts focused on the geopolitical implications, the potential for military conflict, the disruption to oil markets, the strategic challenge of confronting Russian and Chinese interests in our hemisphere. But Sachs wasn't just talking about foreign policy, he was talking about domestic consequences. And if you understand history, you know exactly what those consequences look like. When governments face existential threats or massive funding requirements, they don't ask politely for your wealth. They take it, and they use emergency powers to do so legally. Let me take you back to April 5th, 1933. The United States was in the depths of the Great Depression. Banks were failing, unemployment was catastrophic, and the government needed capital desperately to fund New Deal programs and stabilize the economy. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The order, issued under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, required all persons to deliver all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, 1933. The penalty for non-compliance, $10,000 in fines or 10 years in prison, or both. Citizens were ordered to turn in their gold and received $20.67 per ounce in return. Shortly after the confiscation was complete, the government revalued gold to $35 per ounce under the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. Let that sink in. The government forced citizens to sell their gold at $20 per ounce, then immediately increased its official value to $35. That's a 69% devaluation of everyone's compensation overnight. This wasn't theft in the traditional sense. It was legal confiscation under emergency powers, and it was justified as necessary for national economic security. Now here's the question everyone should be asking. Could it happen again? And if so, would they target gold or something else? The answer is yes, it could absolutely happen again. And this time, silver is the far more likely target. Here's why. Gold today is largely held by central banks, institutions, and wealthy individuals. The total amount of privately held gold in the United States is substantial but concentrated. More importantly, gold has already been through this process. There's historical precedent, legal framework, and public memory of gold confiscation. Silver is different. Silver is the people's metal. It's affordable. It's accessible. Millions of Americans hold silver coins, bars, and rounds as insurance against currency devaluation and economic instability. The total amount of silver held privately in the United States dwarfs gold in terms of number of holders, even if not in dollar value. More critically, silver is an industrial metal. It's essential for defense manufacturing, electronics, solar panels, medical equipment, and countless military applications. In a wartime economy, silver isn't just a monetary asset, it's a strategic resource. If the government needs to fund a major conflict, and if it needs to secure industrial metals for defense production, silver becomes the obvious target. And the legal framework already exists. The Trading with the Enemy Act has never been repealed. It's been amended and updated, but the core authority remains. The President has broad emergency powers under this act and subsequent legislation, like the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. During a declared national emergency, especially one involving armed conflict, the President can regulate or prohibit transactions in foreign exchange, transfers of credit, and the import or export of currency or securities. Precious metals fall squarely within this authority. So let's talk about Venezuela and why this matters right now. Venezuela is in economic collapse, but it's sitting on resources that make it geopolitically critical. The largest oil reserves in the world, significant gold deposits. And increasingly, it's a proxy battleground for Russian and Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. Russia has provided military support to Venezuela. Chinese investment has propped up its failing economy. Both nations have strategic interests in maintaining a foothold near the United States. If tensions escalate, whether through a humanitarian crisis, a military incident, or deliberate provocation, the United States could find itself in a proxy conflict with nuclear powers on our own doorstep. That's not World War III in the traditional sense, but it's close enough to justify emergency measures domestically, and this is where Sachs' warning becomes chilling. A conflict with Venezuela, especially one involving Russian or Chinese military support, would trigger a cascade of domestic emergency declarations, energy security, national defense mobilization, economic warfare measures. And under those emergency powers, the confiscation of strategic resources held by private citizens becomes not just possible, but probable. The justification would be straightforward and politically palatable. We need silver for the war effort. We need it for defense manufacturing. We need it to support our troops. Anyone hoarding it is undermining national security. It won't be called confiscation. It'll be called mandatory sale or patriotic contribution or strategic resource allocation. But the result is the same. You'll be required to surrender your silver to the Treasury at a government-set price. And just like in 1933, that price will be far below market value. Now, you might be thinking this sounds extreme. Surely the government wouldn't do this. Surely there would be massive public opposition. Let me ask you this. Would there be public opposition to confiscating the wealth of hoarders during a time of war when soldiers are dying overseas? The propaganda writes itself. While our brave men and women fight for freedom, some people are sitting on stockpiles of strategic metals that could save lives and win the war. Is that fair? Is that patriotic? Most people don't own silver. Most people wouldn't be affected. And most people in a time of national crisis would support measures that claim to help the war effort. This is how it works. You create the emergency. You identify the resource. You demonize the holders. And you execute the confiscation with the full force of law and public support. So what are the signs that this is already in motion? Let's look at what's happening right now in the silver market because the indicators are already flashing red. First, mint rationing. The United States Mint, along with mints in other countries, has been experiencing persistent supply constraints. Production of silver eagles and other bullion coins has been rationed or delayed repeatedly over the past few years. The official explanation is supply chain issues and unprecedented demand. But here's the question. If demand is so high and premiums are so attractive, why aren't mints dramatically increasing production? Why are we seeing rationing instead of expansion? One possibility that's rarely discussed. Governments are quietly diverting silver supply for other purposes: strategic reserves, defense stockpiling, preparation for future controls. Second, soaring premiums. The premium you pay over spot price for physical silver has exploded. It's not unusual to see premiums of $5, $6, $7 per ounce or more. That's a 30 to 40% premium over spot price in some cases. This isn't normal market behavior. This is a massive disconnect between paper silver prices and physical silver availability. The paper market says silver is $28. The physical market says you'll pay $35 if you can find it. That disconnect tells you something important. There's a shortage of physical metal, and the futures market pricing doesn't reflect physical reality. Third, ETF concerns. Silver ETFs like SLV claim to hold physical silver backing their shares, but serious questions have been raised about whether these funds actually hold the silver they claim, whether that silver is allocated or unallocated, and what would happen if a large number of shareholders demanded physical delivery simultaneously. Sophisticated investors are quietly moving away from paper silver, ETFs, futures, certificates, and into physical metal they can hold themselves. That's not a coincidence. Fourth, vault movements. There's been significant movement of silver into private vaults, particularly offshore vaults in jurisdictions with strong property rights and privacy laws. Singapore, Switzerland, Liechtenstein. Wealthy investors are moving metal out of the United States entirely. Why would they do that unless they believed there was a risk of domestic confiscation? And fifth, legal preparations. There have been quiet discussions in policy circles about strategic resource management during national emergencies. These discussions don't make headlines, but they're happening. Think tanks are writing papers. Agencies are updating emergency protocols. The framework is being built. None of these things alone proves confiscation is imminent, but together they form a pattern, and that pattern matches historical precedent almost perfectly. Let's talk about the mechanics of how a modern Executive Order 6102 for silver would actually work. The President would declare a national emergency under existing statutory authority. The emergency would be justified by the conflict, probably Venezuela, possibly Taiwan, potentially multiple simultaneous crises. Within that declaration, strategic metals, including silver, would be designated as critical resources for national defense. A new executive order would mandate that all persons in the United States surrender silver bullion coins and bars above a certain threshold, probably something like 100 ounces to allow for small personal holdings and avoid targeting casual collectors. You would be required to sell your silver to the Federal Reserve or designated Federal Reserve banks at a set price. That price would likely be tied to the current spot price or slightly above it, but well below what you'd get in the free market. Failure to comply would result in criminal penalties, fines of hundreds of thousands of dollars, federal prison time, asset seizure, asset. There would be exemptions, just like in 1933, rare coins with numismatic value, industrial users with legitimate business needs, jewelry. But bullion and investment-grade silver, that would be confiscated. The order would give you maybe 30 to 60 days to comply. After that, enforcement would begin, and enforcement wouldn't be subtle. Financial institutions would be required to report large silver transactions. Safety deposit boxes could be searched. Import and export of silver would be prohibited. Online dealers would be monitored. This isn't speculation. This is exactly how Executive Order 6102 worked for gold. And there's no reason to think a silver confiscation would operate any differently. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Would people actually comply? In 1933, compliance with the gold confiscation order was widespread, but not universal. Many people turned in their gold as required. Others hid it. Some moved it overseas. There were prosecutions, but enforcement was imperfect. Today, enforcement would be far more sophisticated: digital tracking of purchases, financial surveillance, data mining. The government's ability to identify and locate silver holders is vastly greater than it was 90 years ago, but there would still be resistance. Some people would hide their silver. Some would claim it was lost or stolen. Some would bury it or move it offshore before the order takes effect. The key question is, would you know early enough to act? And that's why Sachs's warning matters so much right now. If you wait until the executive order is signed, it's too late. By that point, borders are being monitored. Transactions are being flagged. Dealers are shut down. Your window to act has closed. The time to prepare is before the crisis, not during it. So what does preparation actually look like? For some people, it means moving metal into private non-bank storage, not a bank safety deposit box. Those can be seized under emergency powers. Private vault services that aren't integrated with the financial system. For others, it means moving metal offshore into jurisdictions that have strong property rights and no history of confiscation. Switzerland has a long tradition of protecting private property even during global conflicts. Singapore has become a major precious metal storage hub. For still others, it means diversifying into assets that are harder to confiscate or track. Real estate in multiple jurisdictions. Cryptocurrency, foreign bank accounts in privacy-friendly countries. And for many, it simply means understanding the risk and making an informed decision about whether holding large amounts of silver in the United States is worth the potential consequences. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to make sure you understand what the risks are. But here's what I can tell you with absolute certainty. The idea that the government would never confiscate private assets during a national emergency is contradicted by history. It happened with gold in 1933. It happened with Japanese-American property during World War II. It happened with Iranian assets during the hostage crisis. It happens. And silver, given its strategic importance and widespread private ownership, is a prime target. Now let's talk about the timeline, because timing is everything. If Sachs is right about Venezuela being the flashpoint, we're potentially talking about a crisis that could unfold within months, not years. The situation in Venezuela is already unstable. Opposition movements, humanitarian disasters, regional tensions, add in Russian or Chinese military provocations, or U.S. intervention to protect oil interests, and you have a recipe for rapid escalation. Once the conflict begins, the timeline for domestic emergency measures would be fast. Emergency declarations happen within days. Executive orders follow within weeks. Compliance deadlines would be measured in months. From the moment tensions escalate to the moment you're required to surrender your silver could be less than 6 months. That's not a lot of time to make decisions, move assets, or restructure your holdings. And here's the critical point. By the time the mainstream media is talking about potential confiscation, it's already too late. The smart money moves before the headlines, not after. Right now, today, this story isn't on CNBC. It's not on Bloomberg. Most people have no idea this risk even exists. That's your advantage. That's your window. Let me be very clear about something. I'm not saying sell all your silver. I'm not saying confiscation is guaranteed. I'm saying the risk is real. It's based on historical precedent, and current geopolitical developments make it more likely than at any time in the past 70 years. You need to assess your own situation. How much silver do you hold? Where is it stored? How visible is it to authorities? What's your exit strategy if an emergency order is announced? These aren't paranoid questions. These are prudent risk management questions that anyone holding significant precious metals should be asking. There's another dimension to this that's worth discussing. Why silver instead of gold this time? In 1933, the government confiscated gold because gold was money. The dollar was backed by gold. Controlling gold meant controlling the money supply. Today, gold is still important, but it's not money in the same way. The dollar hasn't been backed by gold since 1971. Central banks hold gold as a reserve asset, but it's not the foundation of the monetary system anymore. Silver is different. Silver is consumed. It's used up in industrial processes and doesn't get recovered. Every smartphone, every solar panel, every military electronic system contains silver that will never be reclaimed. In a war economy, especially one focused on high-tech defense systems, renewable energy for strategic independence, and advanced electronics, silver consumption would skyrocket. The government would need massive quantities of silver, and they'd need it fast. Mining production can't ramp up quickly enough. Import dependencies create strategic vulnerabilities. The fastest way to secure large quantities of silver? Confiscate it from private holders? You'd be forced to surrender your silver at, say, $30 per ounce. The government would then allocate that silver to defense contractors at controlled prices. Those contractors would build weapon systems, communications equipment, and strategic infrastructure. Your silver would directly fund and supply the war effort, whether you support that war or not. And here's the truly insidious part. The government would claim they're paying fair market value, $30 per ounce based on spot price. But physical silver would be trading at $50 or $60 if it were available. You'd be compensated at paper price for a physical asset in a market where physical is unavailable. You'd lose 30 to 50% of your wealth instantly, with no recourse and no appeal. This is why sophisticated investors are already moving. They're not waiting for confirmation. They're not waiting for official announcements. They're reading the same historical patterns and geopolitical indicators we're discussing right now, and they're acting. Private vault services in Switzerland have reported increased demand from American clients. Singapore dealers have seen surges in large purchases. Offshore trusts and asset protection structures are being established at accelerating rates. The wealthy are preparing. The question is, are you? Let's address some objections, because I know what some viewers are thinking. Objection 1. The government would never do this because it would be too unpopular. Response. It was unpopular in 1933 too. It happened anyway. During a war, with proper framing, it would be portrayed as patriotic. Support our troops, sacrifice for the nation. Anyone who refuses is a hoarder and a traitor. Public opinion is malleable, especially during crises. Objection 2. There's not enough silver held privately to make confiscation worthwhile. Response. Estimates suggest Americans hold somewhere between 500 million to over 1 billion ounces of silver privately. At current prices, that's $15 to $30 billion worth. More importantly, it's the physical quantity that matters for industrial use, not just the dollar value. That amount of silver could supply defense manufacturing for years. Objection 3. Enforcement would be impossible. People would just hide their silver. Response. Enforcement doesn't need to be perfect to be effective. If 90% of holders comply out of fear of prosecution, that's more than enough to achieve the government's goals. The 10% who hide their silver would be taking serious legal risks. Some would be caught and prosecuted as examples. Most people don't have the stomach for felony charges and prison time. Objection 4. This is just fear-mongering to manipulate the silver market. Response. I gain nothing from you moving your silver offshore or changing your storage. I'm pointing out historical precedent and current risk factors. You can verify everything I've said. Executive Order 6102 is historical fact. The Trading with the Enemy Act is still law. Sachs did issue warnings about Venezuela. These aren't opinions, they're facts. What you do with those facts is your decision. Now, let's talk about what happens if confiscation doesn't occur. What if this analysis is wrong and there's no executive order targeting silver? If that happens, you've taken precautions that cost you some money in storage fees or perhaps some opportunity cost. Your silver is still yours, it's just stored differently or in a different location. But if confiscation does occur and you haven't prepared, you lose 30 to 50% of your wealth with no recourse. That's an asymmetric risk profile. The downside of not preparing is catastrophic. The downside of preparing unnecessarily is minimal. This is exactly why sophisticated investors and family offices focus so heavily on asset protection and jurisdictional diversification. They're not paranoid, they're prudent. Let me share something that should concern everyone paying attention. In the past year, there have been multiple instances of governments around the world implementing emergency economic measures that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Canada froze bank accounts of protesters during the trucker convoy, no due process, no court orders, just emergency declarations and frozen assets. Several European countries have discussed or implemented wealth taxes targeting specific asset classes. The United States has dramatically expanded financial surveillance and reporting requirements for cryptocurrency and precious metals transactions. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented actions by democratic governments operating under rule of law. If stable democracies are willing to freeze bank accounts and implement emergency wealth controls during relatively minor domestic protests, what do you think they'd be willing to do during a major war? The answer should be obvious. Anything they believe is necessary. And precious metals confiscation has already been established as legally permissible and historically precedented. Here's what keeps me up at night about this situation. The geopolitical stage is set. Venezuela is a powder keg. Russia and China are increasingly assertive. The U.S. is overextended militarily and drowning in debt. The legal framework is in place. Emergency powers are broad and well established. The Trading with the Enemy Act gives the president enormous authority. The economic incentive is clear. The government needs funding for potential conflicts it can't afford. Silver is strategically important and held widely by private citizens. The propaganda narrative is ready-made. Patriotic sacrifice, supporting our troops, hoarders undermining national security, and the public is largely unaware. Most people have no idea this is even a possibility. There would be no organized resistance until it's too late. All the pieces are in place. The only question is, will they pull the trigger? Jeffrey Sachs seems to think the disaster is coming, and if he's right, the confiscation won't be far behind. So let me end with this. I'm not here to sell you fear. I'm not here to manipulate you into panic selling or buying or any specific action. I'm here to make sure you understand that history repeats itself, especially when governments face existential crises. In 1933, Americans who saw the warning signs and moved their gold offshore or into private storage before Executive Order 6102 protected their wealth. Those who waited or who thought it could never happen lost 69% of their gold's value overnight. Right now, in 2025, we're seeing warning signs that eerily parallel that era. Geopolitical tensions, economic stress, government debt crises, and a vulnerable, strategically important metal held widely by private citizens. The difference is that this time you've been warned. You've seen the historical precedent. You understand the mechanism. You know the risks. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. But here's what I'd ask you to consider. In 5 years, if confiscation happens, would you rather look back and think, I'm glad I prepared even though it cost me some storage fees? Or would you rather look back and think, I knew this was possible and I did nothing? The choice is yours. But the window for making that choice is closing faster than most people realize. They'll send soldiers overseas to give them an excuse to send agents to your safe at home. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's historical pattern recognition. And if Sachs is right about the disaster coming, your financial sovereignty will be the first casualty. Thank you for watching tonight. Do your own research. Verify everything I've said. Make your own informed decisions. But whatever you do, don't ignore this warning. The cost of being wrong is too high. Good night.